And we're back.
Welcome back.
Yeah, so now we have Leah.
We have Leah, and we have sound with Leah. We
Right.
always had Leah, but now we have the sound. So we're really welcome, Leah. Welcome back to Autism Live and to Let's Talk Autism with Shannon and Nancy.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm very excited. I was just telling you guys that Wednesday is one of my highlights when I get to come onto the show, and very exciting to me that I'm a regular. So.
Right.
Well, you are a regular. And so for people who are just tuning in, tell them what you do for the Center for Autism and Related Disorders and what you're going to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Leah. I am a research coordinator, as you can see on the screen, which is also a very exciting part of the show for me. And so what that means is that I'm part of our research team at corporate. So I work for Center for Autism and Related Disorders, and I'm part of our research and development team, which in my opinion is a very, very cool team. And so what the research and development team does is we run our own studies. So we take some questions that the research team thinks is really important, that will help our families and the communities we serve in the answers we find. So they might be about how we can have better therapy. They might be, how we can make sure that our behavioral therapists are coming to their sessions, things like that. Everything that just kind of makes sure that things are running smoothly, that the therapies we're providing are top notch, that we can prove to insurance companies and the world at large that our therapies are top notch. So that's what our research team does. And on top of that, my day is spent kind of looking at different articles that are coming out, summarizing them for our supervisors. So again, that we can make sure that that therapy we're providing is top notch, at the cutting edge of the research that's coming out, because there's a lot, and making sure just that we are providing the best care that we can for the communities that we serve. And so the last time I was on the show, I think, talking about a virtual reality study that just came out. That was super cool. Again, if I say so myself. And so today what I'm really excited to talk about, and I try to find articles that are just coming out. So this was just published in this month, January 2020, in a journal called Autism Research. And Autism Research Journal usually tries to look at some of the more cutting edge technology and autism research coming out, so like virtual reality and things. And generally have very, very lovely studies that have really nice quality, good controls, and generally really lovely and well written. So the article that I'm going to talk about today is called Early Language Exposure that Supports Later Language Skills in Infants with and Without Autism. And the team that was on this there's like 15 authors on this paper from different universities, which is very exciting because it means a lot of people went in to collaborate. And this is I really love when there's research about language. I think it's super interesting, and I think it's a really lovely way that parents can potentially start with kids very young and get a lot of lovely rewards coming out of their effort as a parent. So generally, there's a lot of research with typically developing infants and early language, and there's a lot of research that shows that the more input, language input, and the earlier that infants are getting that language input, the better their outcomes will be, their language outcomes will be, and their cognitive skills will be later in life. And that's very cool for typically developing kids, but what does that mean for kids with autism, right? And I would imagine that, and sometimes we've heard that, parents don't want to confuse their kids, especially if they have been diagnosed with autism, because they really want to make sure that that kid can say the word blue. And if they provide all of this input, are they going to confuse them? Should they limit their speech? What should they do? So the hypothesis for the paper, the authors were trying to answer two things. One was, if there's richer caregiver speech, would that positively impact the language skills? And specifically, they were trying to answer this with kids who were diagnosed with autism. And then one of the things that the literature also says is not only is the caregiver speech very impactful, the maternal education, so the mom's education, is also something impactful. And so they wanted to see, was there any impact or any factors that would mediate that factor? Was there anything that could help mediate the maternal education? So the participants for this study, there were 3 cohorts, which is just a lovely fancy science word for groups. And so they had one that was high risk, high familial risk with ASD. So that means that a sibling had ASD and then the participant also had ASD. They had a low familial risk without ASD group, so that means that they only had, the participant had typically developing siblings, and the participant was also typically developing. And then they had a control group, and the participant was typically developing, and there was no first-degree relatives with ASD. So that control group is really like very pure, typically developing. There's no autism in the family. And then they were trying to kind of figure out the genetics there and try to control the genetics there by having those low-risk familial and high-risk familial groups. And so what they found, well, let me take a step back. I did say that they were trying to figure out richer caregiver speech. And the way that they looked at caregiver speech was twofold. One was they did something called adult word count, and you might also see this in other language papers called like MLU, which is mean length utterances. And it's just how many words, and sometimes they do it, I think, by like syllables and things like that. But this one was how many words the adults were giving to the child. And then they also looked at something called caregiver-child interactions. And what they did with that were conversational turn taking. So the infant, every time the infant vocalized, if the parent then responded with some kind of conversation. So they looked at those two factors, the adult word count and those caregiver-child interactions. And what they found was that hearing more words and having more conversational turns impacted positively all the groups with later language skills. And I realized I didn't tell you guys what the later language they were doing. So part of the reason this study was really exciting to me as well is that it's a longitudinal study, which means that they took a very long time and watched these kids develop. So they checked out the kids at 9 months, at 15 months, and then a year later. So this is like a good 2 years of research here that they're looking at this data. So really lovely long-term to kind of see what the effects are. So they looked at, again, these adult word utterances and the child caregiver interactions. And the way that they measured them, again, very, very cool, was that they had an embedded vocalization recording device on the infant's clothes. And they instructed the families to keep that on for 16 hours. And that would catch all of the words and all of the utterances from everyone that was communicating with this child. And they threw out anything that was less than 8 hours of recording, and they kept everything between 8 and 16 hours of recording. And so again, looking at those child caregiver interactions and those adult word utterances, they found that over time, all the groups benefited from more conversational turns and from more adult word utterances to the child, and that was correlated positively to better language skills later in life. So that's awesome, right? So the takeaway here is all kids, regardless of if you have a diagnosis of ASD or if you don't, all of those kids are going to do better later in life with having more language input and having those conversational turn takings. They also found that, and this is pretty common with this research, that maternal education, so the higher education of the mother, also led to greater language skills in the children. However, and this is really cool, caregiver speech also helped mitigate that. So it also helped make it so that the maternal education was not as big of a factor in the later child language skills. So again, increasing the language that your child is hearing and making sure you're having those conversational turn takings is super important. And that was, in and of itself, that's very cool, right? We've seen this with typically developing children, but we haven't seen it as much with kids with ASD, and you could understand how this is a question parents and clinicians might be asking. But that's not it. That's not all of their findings. I loved this study. I thought it was
Wait, there's more.
Wait, there's more. Yeah.
This is why Wednesdays, when I get to come on the show and just like talk about things I love, I get very excited. So one of the other really cool that they found, or interesting, is that typically developing kids experienced a shift at 9 and 15 months. And so what you saw was at 9 months, the kids were having a lot of adult utterances and not so many conversational turn-taking, which makes sense. At 9 months, these kids are not necessarily making as much noise as at 15 months or a year later. And those child and caregiver interactions were specifically when the baby vocalized and then the parent responded, right? What they found was that at 9 months, you were seeing a lot more adult interactions or utterances, and then at 15 months, that switched for the typically developing kids. So you saw a decrease in the adult word interactions, and you saw an increase in the conversational turn taking. Okay, that's cool. What about the kids with the ASD, right? So what we saw was I say we as if I did the study, I didn't. What the researchers saw was that the infants diagnosed with ASD saw the same decrease. So they also saw a decrease in adult utterances to them between 9 and 15 months, but they didn't see the increase in the turn-taking, the conversational turn-taking. So the authors talk about that as well, that might correlate to conversational difficulties, social communication difficulties that you see in individuals diagnosed with autism. They also thought that there might be something going on with the repetitive behaviors, and that might also be affecting these conversational turn-taking interactions that you're seeing with typically developing kids and not with the kids with autism. So I thought that was super interesting to kind of think about as a parent, making sure that even though your child might not be hitting those milestones at 15 months, because we do see those delays with children with autism, to keep that input, to keep those conversational turn-takings that might not be vocal at that point. Maybe your kiddo looks to the right and you want to be like, that's great, let's talk about that weird tree that you just saw, and just kind of talk at them perchance. And that interactions are still super important to make sure you're still doing those. And every time I come onto the show, I do try to talk about the downfalls of the research. So every single paper, if you scroll to the very end, after the discussion section, should have kind of a disclaimer that kind of explains, this is what, even though our study is really, really cool and we tried to make it as great as we could, we're all human, research is not perfect, and these are the limitations. So this also had limitations, and the researchers do a lovely job again of talking about those limitations. One of them being that most of our participants were high SES, is something you'll see in research, and that stands for socioeconomic status. So that means that these families generally had a higher income, a fairly high income. So they do talk about making sure that you're doing research with all socioeconomic status, folks in a lower bracket and a higher bracket. The researchers also talk about how they only used families that fit into Western culture, and that might not apply. So the study might not be able to be replicated with folks from a different culture. And they also talk about their exclusion criteria. So their exclusion criteria was great in part because it does get you a lot of control with the genetics. But it also means, like I said, all the cohorts, all the groups had to have a sibling, and the first two with the high familial risk had to either have a sibling that had ASD or didn't have ASD, and so you always had to have a participant who had a sibling, and that really limits your options of participants, right? You couldn't necessarily just have your firstborn an only child in the study. So super interesting. Again, I think they did a great job really laying out issues that they saw that could affect the results that they're seeing, that the study does still need being able to be replicated, but very interesting. And like I said, I love looking at language papers because I think it's something that all parents can kind of remind themselves to do, to be really cognizant of the words that you're giving to your child. And those conversational turn-takings, even if your kiddo is being diagnosed with autism and doesn't necessarily have the ability to vocalize as much as a typically developing kiddo, still making sure that you're providing high quality input, that you're providing those words, that you're providing those turn takings, whatever it looks like, right? So even if you're talking at your kid because they're 9 months or 15 months, you're still providing something for them, and it really might, and there seems to be a fair amount of research to imply that there is a lot of benefit later on in life by just providing those words and describing everything around your kid, and explaining, yeah, that's a green grass and that's a brown tree, and hey, that's a dog, yeah, that's what you're seeing, like that has a wet nose, like I don't know. But so very, very cool study, lovely work from this group who really, I think, did a nice job trying to control as much as they could and really explaining the downfalls, again, with the SES and having to make sure you had a sibling with the participants. But overall, super cool takeaways, and hopefully good, ROI for your investment from a parent's perspective.
Right.
So my takeaway, and do you remember seeing the video that was viral a couple months ago with the great dad that he's sitting there on the couch with his very small baby?
Yes.
And the baby is like, and the dad goes, I know, I thought he was out over the line too. And
Right.
the baby goes, and the dad goes, I don't know, your mom's going to be upset about that. And he's having this fake interaction
Right.
with his child, and everybody watched it and everybody said what a great dad.
Right.
But that we really need to up our game as autism parents and be doing that with our kids at whatever level that they're
Right.
at.
Lots of talking with our kids.
When they're early young kids, just be verbalizing, keep a
Right.
running monologue going, but have a fake dialogue too that it has a benefit.
Right. That's my takeaway as well.
Is that,
Let's
are we
talk.
we're in the neighborhood?
You guys are spot on. I don't even know why I show up. You guys are perfect. At the end, I'm always nodding my head aggressively when you guys talk. Yeah, perfect.
Well, because we can't decipher the research. That's why you're here. We might have had a different takeaway. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's really important information, and I don't know if we would have had it otherwise. So thank you so much. I don't know if you're back with us next month. I think Karen's back with us next month, but then hopefully we'll see you again the month after.
Yeah, you guys can't get rid of me, so
I
I'm
hope
here
that's
as much
true.
as I'm allowed to be.
Well,
yeah,
we love your enthusiasm.
Thank you, Leah.
And we love your beautiful brain. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you guys so much for having me on. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for watching Autism Live. To subscribe, click here. And if you'd like to check out some more of our videos, click here.